October 12, 1962, 8:15 p.m. Wells Restaurant, Harlem. The clink of heavy silverware against porcelain was the only sound that dared to challenge the low, rumbling murmur of conversation. In Harlem, on a Friday night, Wells Restaurant was more than a place to eat. It was a court, a chapel, a throne room, and Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, was its undisputed king. He sat in his usual booth, the one in the back corner, affording him a panoramic view of every soul who entered and exited. The dark wood of the booth was worn smooth by the press of his expensive suits over the years, a silent testament to his permanence. A plate of chicken and waffles, the house specialty, sat before him, the steam coiling into the smoky air like a phantom. He hadn't touched it. His attention was on the chessboard he'd set up on the opposite side of the table, a silent game he played against himself, his mind always needing to be 10 moves ahead. His presence was a physical weight in the room. Men of consequence, numbers runners with satchels of cash, policy bankers, jazz musicians fresh from a set at the Apollo, would nod in his direction, a gesture of fealty he would acknowledge with a barely perceptible dip of his chin. Women, draped in furs and fragrant with perfume, would offer smiles that were both reverent and cautious. Bumpy was the lord of Harlem, the protector of its intricate, unsanctioned economy. He was the bulwark against the encroachment of the downtown mobs, the arbiter of disputes, the ghost in the machine of the city's black metropolis. He was power incarnate, his gaze steady, his tailored suit immaculate, his silence more commanding than any shouted order. Tonight, that power felt as comfortable and familiar as the starched collar of his shirt. He moved a black knight, capturing a white pawn with a soft click. He was in control. Everything on the board, everything in this room, everything north of 110th Street, was accounted for. A man named Finley, who ran the policy slips on 125th, approached the booth, his hat held nervously in his hands. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his voice a respectful whisper. "Just wanted to say, that business with the precinct captain, it's been handled. The pressure's off. We're grateful." Bumpy didn't look up from the board. He simply gestured with a long-fingered hand toward an empty chair. "Sit, Finley. Have a drink." The offer was a dismissal, a signal that the matter was closed and gratitude was unnecessary. Business was business. Protection was part of the service. Finley, understanding the protocol, simply nodded again, a wave of relief washing over his face, and backed away. Bumpy saw the board. He saw the city. He saw the interlocking pieces of a kingdom he had built with intellect, violence, and an unshakable code of honor. He saw everything. He believed he was ready for anything. The universe, however, was preparing to call his bluff. October 12, 1962, 9:30 p.m. Wells Restaurant, Harlem. The front door of Wells burst open, letting in a gust of cool autumn air and a man who moved with a frantic energy that was utterly alien to the restaurant's controlled atmosphere. It was Junie Bird, Bumpy's most trusted lieutenant, his right hand for 2 decades. Junie was normally a man of profound stillness, a mirror of Bumpy's own composure. But tonight, his face was a mask of raw panic. His tie was askew, his jacket unbuttoned, and his eyes, wide and searching, scanned the room until they locked onto Bumpy's booth. He stumbled as he moved, bumping into a table and barely noticing the spilled drink. The entire restaurant fell silent. A fork dropped, the sound as loud as a gunshot. All eyes turned from Bumpy to Junie, then back to Bumpy, waiting for the king's reaction to this unprecedented breach of decorum. Bumpy's hand froze over the chessboard. He looked up, his expression unreadable, but a cold knot began to tighten in the pit of his stomach. Junie never lost his cool. Never. In shootouts, in police raids, in sit-downs with the most volatile of men, Junie was ice. To see him like this meant something had broken. Something fundamental. Junie reached the booth, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He leaned heavily on the table, his knuckles white. "Bumpy," he choked out, the name a raw, desperate plea. "It's Elise." Elise. The name hit Bumpy like a physical blow. Junie's daughter. Bumpy's goddaughter. A bright, beautiful 16-year-old girl with a smile that could disarm armies. A girl he had held as a baby, whose scraped knees he had bandaged, whose report cards he had celebrated with more pride than any criminal victory. She was the light in the center of their dark world, the one purely good thing they all swore to protect. What about her, Junie? Bumpy's voice was low, dangerously calm, but the cold knot in his stomach was now a block of ice. She's gone, Junie whispered, his composure finally shattering. Tears streamed down his face, cutting paths through the sweat on his cheeks. She was supposed to be home from the library hours ago. Her mother's going out of her mind. I've been everywhere, Bumpy. Her friends' houses, the school, the park, everywhere. She's just gone. For a single, terrifying moment, the king was gone. The carefully constructed persona of the untouchable Harlem Godfather dissolved, replaced by the face of a man staring into an abyss. He looked at his oldest friend, his brother in all but blood, and saw his own fear reflected in Junie's eyes. The chessboard, with its predictable moves and controllable outcomes, suddenly seemed like a child's toy. The real world, brutal and random, had just swept all the pieces off the board. He slowly rose from the booth, his half-eaten meal forgotten. The quiet hum of the restaurant had become a suffocating silence. He placed a hand on Junie's shoulder, the gesture both a comfort and an anchor for himself. "We'll find her," he said, the words a vow. "We'll find her," but as he led Junie away from the prying eyes of his court, a terror unlike any he had ever known began to consume him. October 12, 1962, 10 p.m., office above the Rhythm Club, Harlem. The office was Bumpy's sanctuary, a place of quiet contemplation paneled in dark mahogany and filled with books on history, philosophy, and poetry. It was here he retreated to think, to plan, to be Ellsworth Johnson rather than Bumpy. But tonight, the room was a cage. He paced the floor, the plush Persian rug doing nothing to soften the harsh, repetitive thud of his footsteps. Junie sat slumped in a leather armchair, his head in his hands, muttering his daughter's name over and over like a prayer. "She's a good girl, Bumpy," Junie mumbled, his voice thick with despair. "She don't run with a fast crowd. She loves books. The library, that's her place." Bumpy stopped pacing and stared out the window at the neon glow of 125th Street below. The street was alive, people moving, cars passing, life going on as if the world hadn't tilted on its axis. He felt a profound and terrifying powerlessness. He could move mountains of cash, make politicians tremble, bring the city's commerce to a halt with a single phone call. But he couldn't find one 16-year-old girl. His empire, his reputation, his money, it was all meaningless. The feeling was so alien, so disorienting, it made him physically nauseous. He turned from the window and saw Junie, utterly broken. And in that moment, the dam inside Bumpy Johnson broke. The king vanished completely. He sank into the chair behind his grand desk, the one that had served as his throne for so long, and dropped his face into his hands. His broad shoulders, which carried the weight of a community, began to shake. A dry, ragged sob escaped his throat, a sound of such profound anguish that Junie looked up, his own grief momentarily forgotten in his shock. He had never seen Bumpy cry. Not when he was sentenced to prison, not when friends were killed, not once in 20 years. To see it now was like watching a statue bleed. Bumpy Johnson, the myth, the legend, was weeping. He was weeping for the little girl he'd sworn to protect, for his friend's agony, and for the sudden, horrifying realization of his own limitations. He was just a man whose goddaughter was missing. The phone on his desk rang, shrill and demanding. Bumpy flinched, then snatched it up, his voice a raw bark. "Yeah." It was Dell, one of his top men. "Boss, we might have something. One of the girls who works the counter at the luncheonette near the library, she says she saw Elise. Said she left with her friend, Sarah, and Sarah's cousin. They were headed to a party, she thought. Over on Edgecombe." A fragile, desperate hope flickered in the room. A party. A simple, teenage act of rebellion. Bumpy's mind seized on it. Of course. She wasn't hurt. She wasn't in danger. She had just been irresponsible. He would be angry. He would lecture her. But she would be safe. The relief was so intense it almost buckled his knees. "A party," he repeated, his voice cracking. "Are you sure?" "That's what the girl said, Bumpy. Sarah's cousin from Philly. They were all Logan. Find that house," Bumpy commanded, a sliver of his authority returning. Now, he hung up and looked at Junie, managing a weak, reassuring smile. "You hear that? A party. She's at a party. Junie looked up, his eyes bloodshot but clinging to the same thread of hope. For 20 agonizing minutes, they waited, the silence in the room thick with unspoken prayers. The phone rang again. Bumpy grabbed it. Bumpy. Dell's voice was flat, devoid of the earlier excitement. It's a bust. We found Sarah. She's at home. Been there all night, studying with her mother. She hasn't seen Elise since school let out. The girl at the counter, she got it wrong. It was another girl she saw. She's real sorry. The hope didn't just flicker out. It was extinguished with a violent, suffocating finality. The false alarm was crueler than the initial ignorance. It had given them a glimpse of a normal world, a world of teenage mistakes and parental anger, only to snatch it away and plunge them back into the nameless, formless terror of the unknown. Bumpy slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle. He looked at his hands on the desk. They were trembling. The king was gone again, and this time, he wasn't sure he would ever come back. The war had begun, not with a gunshot, but with the crushing silence of a dead phone line. Witness testimony, Junie Bird. Statement given to federal authorities, April 19, 1963. You asked me when it started. The war. You think it was about turf, about the dope trade. You got it all wrong. It started on a Friday night in October. It started when my heart got torn out of my chest. When I saw Ellsworth, when I saw Bumpy, look helpless. You gotta understand something about the man. He's solid, like the bedrock under this whole city. Things happen around him, but they don't happen to him. He's the one making him happen. But that night, in his office, I saw the bedrock crack. When that call came through, the first one, about the party, I saw him believe it. He wanted to believe it so bad you could feel it. It was like a drowning man grabbing a piece of driftwood. And when the second call came, and the driftwood turned out to be smoke, I saw him die a little, right there in that chair. The light just went out. He didn't say nothing for a long time, just sat there. Then he stood up, and he was different. The fear was still there. I could see it in his eyes, way back. But something else was there now. Something cold, something hard. It was the look of a man who was going to burn the whole world down to find what he was looking for. That's when the war started. Not with Gambino, but with whatever darkness had taken my little girl. He just didn't know the darkness had a name yet. October 12, 1962. 11 p.m. The command center, backroom of the Rhythm Club. The transition was stark, chilling. One moment, Ellsworth Johnson was a broken man. The next, Bumpy Johnson was a general marshaling his forces for war. He stood before a large map of Harlem pinned to the wall, the same map he used to coordinate his policy numbers and oversee his territories. But tonight, the red and blue pins didn't represent assets. They represented search grids. The room was packed with his most trusted men. Dell, Ghana, Finney, Webb. Men who had been with him for years. Men whose loyalty was absolute. The air, once thick with despair, now crackled with a tense, focused energy. Bumpy's voice was devoid of all emotion, a flat, metallic instrument of command. I want every street corner, every tenement, every after-hours joint, every flophouse from the river to the river, from 110th to 155th, turned upside down. He began, his finger tracing a hard line across the map. I want every junkie, every pimp, every booster, every con man, every single soul who draws breath in the shadows of this part of the city, found and squeezed. He turned to face them, his eyes hollow but burning with a cold fire. This is not a request. We are not asking questions. We are demanding answers. Use any means necessary. I don't care about bruised knuckles or broken pride. The only thing I care about is a name, a location, a whisper, anything. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Junie's daughter. My goddaughter. Elise. She is 16 years old. She was wearing a blue coat and carrying a stack of books. He spoke the words as if they were a catechism, the only facts in a world of terrifying uncertainty. There will be a bonus of $5,000 for the information that leads us to her. And for the person or people who have her, there will be a reckoning. The men nodded, their faces grim. They understood. This wasn't about business. This was blood. They filed out of the room, fanning out into the night like a wave, a network of eyes and ears spreading through the veins of Harlem. Bumpy remained at the map, a solitary figure under a single bare bulb. He picked up a pen and pushed it into the location of the library where Elise was last seen. The countdown had begun. October 13th, 1962. 2 a.m. A pool hall on Lenox Avenue. Dell and his crew descended on the smoky room like wraiths. The sharp crack of breaking pool balls ceased. Music from the jukebox died as someone unplugged it. Dell, a large man with hands like cinder blocks, grabbed a well-known informant by the collar of his shirt and slammed him against the wall. Elise Bird, 16, blue coat. Seen her? The man's eyes were wide with fear. He shook his head frantically. Dell held him there for a 10 count, searching his eyes for a flicker of deception, then dropped him in a heap. Next, they moved through the room, a systematic, terrifying sweep. Nothing. The streets were silent. Too silent. October 13th, 1962. 5 a.m. A flophouse on 148th Street. The stench of stale sweat, cheap wine, and despair hung in the air. Ghana kicked open a flimsy door to find 3 men huddled around a small fire in a trash can. He didn't waste time. He showed them a photograph of Elise, a school picture where she was smiling, her eyes bright with promise. The image was jarringly out of place in the squalor of the room. Look at it. Ghana's voice was a low growl. Look at her face. You seen this girl? The men, their minds clouded by drink or dope, shook their heads, their gazes dull and uncomprehending. Ghana snatched the photo back, protecting it from the filth of the room. He felt a surge of rage, not at these broken men, but at the world that could swallow a girl like Elise whole. Another dead end. The sun would be up soon, and the darkness was only deepening. October 13th, 1962. 9 a.m. Bumpy's office. Bumpy had not slept. He sat behind his desk, a telephone receiver practically glued to his ear, listening to a stream of negative reports. His network, so effective at collecting debts and tracking rivals, was failing him. It was as if Elise had simply evaporated. The city had swallowed her. Junie was in the corner, a ghost of the man he'd been 24 hours ago, his eyes fixed on the door, as if he expected Elise to walk through it at any moment. Nothing. Bumpy Dell's voice came over the line, strained with exhaustion. It's like she stepped off the curb and into thin air. No one saw a thing. No one knows a thing. It don't make no sense. A girl like that, in this neighborhood? Someone always sees something. They're lying. Bumpy rasped, his voice raw. Or they're too scared to talk. Scared of who, Bumpy? They're more scared of you than anyone. The question hung in the air. Scared of who? There was only one other power in the city that could impose that kind of silence. A power from downtown. A power that had been trying to push its poison, its heroin, north of Central Park for years, a move Bumpy had consistently and violently blocked. The Italians. Gambino. A cold, sickening dread began to crystallize in Bumpy's mind. This wasn't random. This was a message. They hadn't just taken a girl. They had taken his girl. They had found the one chink in his armor. October 13th, 1962. 1:20 p.m. A tenement stoop, 127th Street. Finney, a slender man with the patient eyes of a hunter, had been working the low-level junkies for hours. He didn't use force. He used what they needed. He'd given a small bag of dope to a twitchy, skeletal man named Skeeter in exchange for information. Most of it was useless rambling. But then, Skeeter, his eyes half closed in a nascent stupor, mumbled something. New stuff, real good stuff, coming out the Bronx. The Italians, they're giving out samples. Hooking new customers. Finney's focus sharpened. What's that got to do with me, Skeeter? Heard they brought in a new girl. Young, real young, to party with. Up in one of the new galleries. Arthur Avenue Way. Skeeter's eyes flickered. Heard she was a colored girl. Not from around there. They was Logan about it. Said she was special, a message to the king uptown. Finney's blood ran cold. He grabbed Skeeter by his filthy shirt. What girl? What did she look like? I dunno, man, Skeeter whined. Heard she was wearing a nice coat. Blue, maybe. They took it from her. Finney was moving before Skeeter finished the sentence. He sprinted down the block to the nearest payphone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He fumbled a dime into the slot, his hands shaking. Bumpy picked up on the first ring. Bumpy, Finney said, his voice tight and urgent. I think I got her. The Bronx. A Gambino shooting gallery. They took her as a message. Silence on the other end of the line. Then, Bumpy's voice, colder and deadlier than Finney had ever heard it. Where? October 13th, 1962. 3 p.m. The Bronx, near Arthur Avenue. The black Cadillac sedan rolled silently down the street, an alien presence in the heart of Italian territory. It was a declaration of war without a single shot fired. Inside, the air was thick and cold. Bumpy sat in the back, staring out the window, his face a granite mask. Beside him, Junie clutched a tire iron, his knuckles bone white, his eyes burning with a hate so pure it was almost holy. In the front seat, Del drove, his gaze sweeping the street, while Ghana sat shotgun, a sawed-off shotgun resting under his coat. This was not an army. It was a scalpel. Bumpy knew that a full-scale invasion would bring down the heat from every direction and, worse, might get Elise killed. This had to be surgical, precise. They were deep in enemy territory, a place where their power and influence meant nothing. Here, there were just 4 black men in a car, and that made them targets. Del pulled the car to a stop a block away from the tenement building Skeeter had described. It was a run-down, 5-story brick building, indistinguishable from a dozen others on the block. But Bumpy could feel it. He could feel the sickness radiating from it. "Ghana, you hold the door," Bumpy said, his voice a low whisper. "Nobody in, nobody out. Del, you're with me and Junie. No guns unless I say so. This is about extraction, not escalation. We take Elise, and we melt away. The reckoning comes later." Junie just nodded, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. He was a coil of pure, compressed violence, ready to spring. Bumpy put a hand on his arm. "Junie, look at me. We get her out. That's the mission. Alive. You understand?" Junie met his gaze, and for a second, Bumpy saw the terrified father underneath the avenging angel. "Alive." Junie repeated the word of prayer. They got out of the car and walked toward the building, their long coats hiding their purpose. The street seemed to hold its breath as they passed. They were ghosts, wraiths of vengeance walking in the afternoon sun, about to step into the heart of the hell that had stolen their angel. October 13th, 1962, 3:45 p.m. A tenement apartment, the Bronx. The door to apartment 4B was flimsy. Del put his shoulder into it, and the wood splintered around the lock with a sickening crack. The smell hit them first. A foul, chemical odor of cooked heroin, mingled with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale cigarette smoke, and human waste. It was the smell of absolute despair. The scene inside was a tableau from hell. The shades were drawn, casting the room in a jaundiced, sickly light. 3 men, gaunt and hollow-eyed, were slumped on a stained mattress and a broken sofa. They were low-level Gambino soldiers, the dregs of the organization, tasked with running this poison factory. A single needle lay on a scorched spoon on the coffee table. The men looked up slowly, their eyes clouded with the drug, their reactions sluggish. Bumpy's gaze swept past them, scanning the small, squalid apartment. His eyes landed on a heap of clothes in the corner. A blue coat. His breath hitched. Then he saw her. She was in the far corner of the room, on a bare, filthy mattress on the floor, almost hidden in the shadows. It was Elise. But it wasn't. The vibrant, smiling girl from the photograph was gone, replaced by this broken doll. Her dress was torn, her hair matted. Her skin was pale and clammy, her eyes half open but unfocused, a trickle of drool on her chin. There was a fresh track mark on the inside of her arm, angry and red against her skin. She was breathing, but barely. A shallow, rattling sound. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, Bumpy couldn't move. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it paralyzed him. This wasn't a kidnapping for ransom. This wasn't a stray bullet in a turf war. This was a violation. They hadn't just taken her. They had defiled her. They had taken her light and tried to extinguish it with the filthiest poison their world produced. They had used her, his goddaughter, to make a point about market share. The cold, controlled rage he'd been nursing for hours erupted into a white-hot supernova of hate that threatened to consume him. Junie made a sound, a wounded, animal cry, and lunged forward. One of the thugs on the sofa, finally registering the intrusion, started to get up, reaching for a gun tucked into his waistband. He never had a chance. October 13th, 1962, 4 p.m., the Bronx. Bumpy's command for no guns was for his men. It was a strategic order. It did not apply to the tire iron in Junie's hand. Before the Gambino soldier could clear his holster, Junie was on him. The first blow was a sickening crunch of metal against bone. The man collapsed without a sound. The other two were still struggling to rise from their narcotic fog when Dell was on them, his massive fists moving with brutal efficiency. It was over in seconds. Not a firefight, but a swift, silent, and deeply personal act of retribution. It was an execution of a different kind. Bumpy didn't watch. His attention was solely on Elise. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside her, his heart shattering into a million pieces. He gently brushed the matted hair from her face. Her skin was cold. "Elise," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't let himself feel until now. "Elise, baby, it's Uncle Bumpy. We're here." Her eyes fluttered, but there was no recognition, just a low, pained moan. He looked at the track mark on her arm and felt a fresh wave of nausea. He, Bumpy Johnson, who had spent years keeping this very poison out of his neighborhood, who had punished his own men for even thinking of dealing it, had let it get to her. The system he fought, the evil he held at bay, had breached his walls and struck at the very center of his heart. In that moment, he saw his own complicity. His life, his choices, his war with the Italians, it had all led here, to this filthy room, to this child on the floor. He carefully wrapped her in a thin, dirty blanket, lifting her into his arms. She weighed nothing. He could feel her fragile bones, the slight, rattling tremor of her body. He held her tight against his chest, as if he could transfer his own strength, his own life force, into her. As he stood up, he looked at the 3 unconscious, or dead, he didn't know or care, forms on the floor. This wasn't the reckoning. This was just the prelude. He carried her out of the apartment, Junie and Dell flanking him like sentinels. Ghana held the front door of the building, his face grim as he saw the small, blanket-wrapped bundle in Bumpy's arms. They walked back to the Cadillac, a silent, grim procession. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint, ragged whisper of Elise's breathing. As Bumpy laid her gently on the back seat, he looked at Junie. The avenging angel was gone, replaced once again by the terrified father, his eyes fixed on his daughter's pale face. The extraction was complete, but Bumpy knew the real battle, the fight for Elise's soul, had just begun. October 13th, 1962, 5:15 p.m. Brownstone, Sugar Hill. The brownstone was one of Bumpy's secret places, a property held under a false name, furnished but rarely used. It was a sanctuary, and tonight, it would become a hospital and a battleground. He carried Elise up the stairs to a master bedroom, a room far too grand for the horror it was about to contain, and laid her on the large bed with its clean, white sheets. The contrast between the pristine bedding and her ravaged state was obscene. Junie stood by the door, unable to come closer, as if he were afraid his own anguish would somehow harm her further. Bumpy called for Dr. Wilson, an old, discreet physician who had treated more gunshot wounds for Bumpy's crew than he had cases of the flu. He owed Bumpy his practice, and more, his silence. Dr. Wilson arrived within the hour, his face impassive as he took in the scene. He was a professional who had learned long ago not to ask questions. He examined Elise, his touch gentle, his expression growing more grave by the second. He checked her pupils, listened to her heart, and examined the angry red mark on her arm. He finally straightened up, turning to face Bumpy and Junie. "It's heroin," he said, his voice low and clinical. "High grade. From the look of her, they didn't just give her a taste. They hit her with a massive dose. An overdose. They were trying to kill her, Mr. Johnson. Or turn her into an instant addict. It's a miracle she's alive." Junie let out a choked sob and had to lean against the doorframe. "What do we do?" Bumpy's voice was a strained whisper. "A hospital would pump her stomach, administer naloxone if they had it, and then hand her over to the police and social services," the doctor said, looking Bumpy directly in the eye. "She would become a ward of the state. A statistic. A colored girl junkie from Harlem. Is that what you want?" Bumpy's jaw tightened. "No. Then we do it here," Dr. Wilson continued. "But you have to understand what that means. We've missed the window to pump her stomach. The drug is in her system. All we can do now is manage the symptoms and pray her heart is strong enough to survive it. And if she does survive, then the withdrawal begins. It will be hell. For her, and for you. 3 days of it, at least. Screaming, convulsions, pain you can't imagine. You have to be prepared for that. Bumpy looked from the doctor to the still, pale form of his goddaughter on the bed. Then he looked at Junie, whose face was a canvas of pure agony. This was his penance. He had to walk through this hell with her. We're prepared, Bumpy said, the words tasting like ash. Do whatever you have to do. October 14th, 1962. Day 1. The withdrawal began not with a bang, but with a tremor. A slight shiver in Elise's hands that quickly spread through her entire body. Dr. Wilson had administered what he could to stabilize her heart, but there was no medicine for this. This was a war that had to be fought by the body itself. By midday, the tremors had become violent convulsions. Elise's back would arch, her teeth would grind, and a low, guttural moan would escape her lips. Bumpy and Junie had to hold her down, their hands on her shoulders and legs, trying to keep her from injuring herself. Holding this fragile girl, who felt like she was being torn apart from the inside, was the hardest physical thing Bumpy had ever done. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but the pain was nothing compared to the agony in his soul. He saw the faces of the men in the Bronx tenement. He saw the needle on the spoon. He saw the whole rotten supply chain, stretching from the poppy fields of Turkey to the docks of Red Hook, all the way to this bedroom in Sugar Hill. A system of greed run by men like Carlo Gambino, men who sat in fancy restaurants and counted their money while this poison destroyed lives, families, communities. He had always seen it as a business problem, a territorial imperative. Keep their dope out, protect his own rackets. But now, holding his goddaughter as her body revolted against their product, he saw it for what it was, a spiritual sickness, an absolute evil. By nightfall, the screaming started. It wasn't a human sound. It was raw, animal pain given voice. It tore through the quiet of the brownstone, a sound that flayed the nerves. Junie, unable to bear it, broke down, retreating to a corner of the room, weeping uncontrollably. Bumpy stayed by the bed. He had to. He held Elise's hand, his thumb stroking the back of it, even as she thrashed and seized. I'm here, baby girl, he whispered over and over, his voice hoarse. I'm right here. You're not alone. You fight. You hear me? You fight. He was speaking to her, but he was also speaking to himself. He was fighting, too. Fighting the guilt, the rage, the overwhelming urge to go out into the night and burn the entire Gambino family to the ground. But he couldn't. His war was here, in this room. Witness testimony, Junie Bird. Statement given to federal authorities, April 19, 1963. Hell. You want to know what hell is? It's a bedroom in a nice house. It's clean sheets. And it's the sound of your own child screaming like her soul is on fire. I couldn't take it. I'm not ashamed to say it. I broke. I'm her father, and I fell apart. I wanted to run. I wanted to die. But Bumpy, he never moved. For 3 days, he barely ate, didn't sleep. He just stayed there. When she was thrashing, he'd hold her. He'd talk to her, softly, telling her stories about when she was a little girl. About the time he took her to Coney Island and she was scared of the big roller coaster. But he held her hand, and she did it anyway. He kept telling her, you're a fighter, Elise. You got my blood in you. You got your daddy's blood in you. We don't quit. When she'd get quiet, he'd just sit there, watching her breathe. I'd see him look at his own hands. Like he was a skin, and why they couldn't do more. Why they couldn't just reach inside her and pull the poison out. I saw a man paying for his sins in that room. Every scream she made, it was like a whip on his back. He was doing penance. He knew his life, his world, had brought this plague to our door, and he wasn't going to leave her side until it was over. He was more of a father in that room than I was. He was a rock. The rock she clung to in the storm, October 15th to 16th, 1962. Day 2 and 3. The physical torment of the first day gave way to a psychological war. The convulsions subsided, replaced by feverish hallucinations. Elise's eyes would fly open, wide with terror, and she would scream at things only she could see. Spiders on the walls. Men in the corners. She begged, pleaded, and cried for her mother. Then, her tormentors. No, please don't, she'd sob, her voice the small, terrified whisper of a child. I want to go home. Please, let me go home. Each word was a fresh knife in the hearts of the 2 men watching over her. Junie, drawing strength from Bumpy's resolve, returned to the bedside. They took turns, bathing her face with cool cloths, trying to soothe her, their voices a constant, low murmur of reassurance in the chaos of her mind. At one point, in a moment of terrifying lucidity, her eyes focused on Bumpy. But she wasn't seeing her loving uncle. She was seeing one of them. She recoiled, scrambling to the far side of the bed. "Get away from me," she shrieked, her voice raw. The words hit Bumpy harder than any bullet ever could. He froze, his hand outstretched. He had become one of the monsters in her head. He slowly backed away from the bed, the look on his face one of utter devastation. He walked out of the room, down the stairs, and stood in the dark living room, his body trembling. This was their victory. This was Gambino's true message. They had not only poisoned her body, they had poisoned her mind against him, the one man who would die for her. He sank into a chair, the darkness of the room a cold comfort, and for the first time, he prayed. Not for forgiveness, not for salvation, but for the strength to see this through. October 17th, 1962. On the morning of the fourth day, they awoke to silence. Not the tense, waiting silence of the past few days, but a true, peaceful quiet. They rushed to the bedroom. The fever had broken. Elise was asleep, her breathing deep and even. The color had started to return to her cheeks. She was slick with sweat, and the sheets were soaked, but she was resting, truly resting. Dr. Wilson came and confirmed it. The worst is over. Her body has won. She's weak, dehydrated, but she's through the fire. He looked at Bumpy and Junie, at their exhausted, haggard faces. Now the hard part begins. Her body is clean, but her mind will crave the drug. She needs professional help. Far away from here. There's a private clinic in Kentucky, quiet, discreet. Specializes in this. It will be expensive. Money is not the object, Bumpy said, his gaze fixed on Elise's sleeping face. He felt a profound, exhausted relief, but no joy. The battle was won, but the war had just been declared. He walked to the window and looked out at the city. He now had a purpose. It wasn't about turf or money or respect anymore. It was about eradication. He was going to cut the head off the snake. He was going to burn Gambino's heroin empire to the ground, starting in his own backyard. He would rip it out root and stem, no matter the cost. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that the cost would be his own freedom. November 1962 to March 1963. Bumpy Johnson's war was not loud. It was methodical, precise, and terrifyingly efficient. He didn't go after Gambino bosses or capos. He went after the supply chain. A warehouse in the Bronx, full of raw opium, mysteriously burned to the ground. A shipment coming in at a New Jersey pier vanished, the crewman found tied up and the truck gone. Key distributors for the Gambino family in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx started disappearing, one by one. Their bodies were never found. He didn't use his own men for the wet work. He brought in outside professionals, ghosts from Chicago and Detroit who came in, did the job, and were gone by morning. His own crew was tasked with intelligence, with finding the weak links in Gambino's chain. He bled them. He dismantled their heroin infrastructure piece by piece, costing them millions and, more importantly, sowing chaos and distrust within their ranks. The flow of high-grade heroin into Harlem slowed to a trickle, then stopped completely. The other families watched, silent. This wasn't a turf war they understood. Bumpy wasn't trying to take over the drug trade. He was trying to annihilate it. It was personal. It was a crusade. And it was drawing an incredible amount of heat. The papers were full of stories about the vanishing gangsters. The feds, who had long been trying to build a case against the mafia, suddenly had a wealth of new leads, all pointing back toward the chaos Bumpy was creating. April 1963. Bumpy knew his time was running out. The war had been won. Harlem was clean, for now, but the blowback was inevitable. He had made too much noise, kicked over too many rocks. He could feel the net closing. He could have run, vanished with his fortune, but that wasn't his way. He had started this, and he would finish it. He had to protect his people, his organization, and most of all, Junie and Elise. If he was taken down in a messy mob war, the retribution against his loved ones would be swift and brutal. He had to control the narrative. He made a call to an old contact, a federal prosecutor he had on his payroll. He fed him information, not on the Italians, but on himself. He laid out a clean, simple, undeniable case for interstate racketeering. It was a charge that would stick, a federal case that would take him out of the city and put him beyond the reach of Gambino's revenge. It was a sacrifice. He was trading his freedom for their safety. A week later, federal agents stormed the Rhythm Club. It was clean, professional. Bumpy was sitting in his office, reading a book of poetry. He didn't resist. He stood up, allowed them to cuff him, and walked out with his head held high. As they led him past the bar, he caught Dell's eye and gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. The message was clear: take care of things. Take care of them. June 1963. The trial was a formality. Bumpy offered no defense. He was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The judge, making an example of him, assigned him to the most notorious prison in the country, Alcatraz. The day before he was to be transported, he was allowed one final visit. Junie came, his face etched with a grief that was somehow deeper than the one he'd worn when Elise was missing. With him was Elise. She was beautiful. The light was back in her eyes. She was healthy, her skin clear, her smile shy but genuine. She had spent the last 6 months at the clinic in Kentucky, and she was whole again. She stood back, hesitant, until Bumpy, in his drab prison jumpsuit, knelt down. "Come here, baby girl," he said, his voice soft. She rushed to him then, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. "I'm sorry, Uncle Bumpy," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry." "You have nothing to be sorry for," he said, holding her tight. "Nothing. You listen to me. You live your life. You be happy. You make something beautiful of it. That's all I want. You promise me." She nodded, her tears soaking his collar. He held her for a long moment, then looked up at Junie. "Take care of our girl." "Always, Bumpy," Junie said, his voice thick. "Always." Bumpy was led away. He didn't look back. The iron doors of Alcatraz were waiting. 1964 to 1973. The Rock was a world unto itself, a place designed to strip a man of his name, his past, his very soul. But Bumpy Johnson was not just any man. He carried his kingdom inside him. He read. He played chess. He maintained his dignity in a place where dignity was a liability. His only connection to the outside world was the letters. They came once a month, first from Junie, then, after a year, from Elise herself. 1965. Her handwriting was still a little shaky. She wrote about finishing high school, about the friends she was making. She included a photograph of herself at graduation, wearing a white dress, holding a diploma. Bumpy kept it tucked inside a copy of Dante's Inferno. 1968. The handwriting was confident, flowing. She was in college at Howard. She was studying social work. "I want to help kids," she wrote. "Kids who get lost. Like I did. You showed me that no one is ever truly lost if someone is looking for them." In his cold, damp cell, Bumpy read that line over and over until the words blurred. 1971. A new photo. Elise, now a young woman, standing outside a community center in Harlem. She was smiling, surrounded by a group of children. She was radiant. She told him about her work, about a boy she had helped get off the streets, about the funding she was securing for a new youth program. She was doing what he never could, fighting the sickness not with violence, but with hope. 1973. A letter from Junie. Bumpy's parole had been granted. Alcatraz had closed a decade ago. He'd been moved to another federal prison, but his sentence was finally over. "She's waiting for you, Bumpy," Junie wrote. "The war is over. Time to come home." Bumpy folded the letter. 10 years. A lifetime. He had walked into prison a king, a warrior. He had paid his penance in isolation and silence. He had watched the world change through photographs and letters. He had watched a broken child become a savior. He wasn't sure who he was anymore. July 12, 1973. Central Park. The man who walked out of the prison gates was older, grayer. The sharp edges of his authority had been worn smooth by time and reflection. He was still Bumpy Johnson, but the weight he carried was different. It was no longer the weight of an empire, but the quiet weight of a life lived and a price paid. Junie was waiting for him, just as he said he would be. They embraced, two old soldiers, brothers bound by a history of violence and love. The ride into the city was quiet. Harlem had changed. It was louder, more vibrant in some ways, more wounded in others. Junie didn't drive him to a welcome home party or a restaurant. He drove to the entrance of Central Park. "She wanted to meet you here," Junie said. On neutral ground, Bumpy got out of the car and walked into the park. The summer sun was warm on his face. And then he saw her. She was sitting on a bench near the reservoir, a woman now, in her late 20s, poised and beautiful. She looked up and saw him. Her face broke into a smile that was so full of light, it seemed to push back the shadows of the past decade. She stood and walked toward him, then started to run. He opened his arms, and she crashed into him, just as she had in that prison visiting room 10 years ago. But this time, there were no tears of sorrow, only joy. She pulled back, her hands on his arms, looking into his face. "Uncle Bumpy," she began, her voice thick with emotion. She stopped, shook her head, a small, radiant smile on her face. The name felt inadequate, a relic of a past they had both survived. She took a breath, her eyes shining. "Welcome home, Pop." The word hit him with the force of a revelation. Pop. Not king, not boss, not a gangster or a legend. Pop. In that single word, his entire life was recontextualized. The violence, the power, the prison sentence, it had all been a long, brutal, bloody path to this one perfect moment of grace. His legacy wasn't the streets he had ruled or the enemies he had crushed. It was her, standing here, whole and happy and free. He wrapped his arms around his daughter and held on, a king who had finally found his kingdom.